What's going on? It's Jason Heath, and we are digging in to some more of my favorite technique materials. We've been doing this here on YouTube for the last few weeks. I'll link up to the playlist in the card up there. Check that out, and if you enjoy these, consider subscribing. Last week, I talked about one of my all-time favorite technique books. It's Boardwalkin' by Hal Robinson. I'll link up to that up top too. And there's no way I can talk about Boardwalkin' without talking about the other book from Hal Robinson. They really go as a pair. That book is Strokin, and it's actually something that I've been using ever since I was a teenager. I just didn't realize it at first. When I got to college, my bass teacher from the Chicago Symphony, Michael Hovnanian, said, go out and buy the Sevcik School of Violin Technique, Opus 2. That's a long title. And when I opened it up, I thought, what is this violin music I'm looking at here? It's all in treble clef, and you can translate it over to bass, and I did, and it was wonderful to use. But there was always something that felt a little bit like tight shoes practicing out of Sevcik for the violin. Maybe it was just seeing the treble clef, or maybe I just wasn't 100% sure if all the bowings applied to bass, or if I should be thinking about different tempos, or that kind of thing. So I was always looking for a bass version of this book, and there were some made, but they always just seemed to be a little bit off. I remember one had the wrong titles at the top of the page. It was talking about spiccato, and it was all long tones or something like that. I don't remember exactly. But I remember hearing all these whisperings back in the late 90s about some magic book that Hal Robinson had created. And that book, called Strokin, is really just the Sevcik School of Violin Technique adapted for bass by one of the great teachers in recent times. And I just can't say enough good things about the way Hal took this book and adapted it to the bass. It is almost identical in terms of what's in there to the violin books, but Hal, especially in terms of the string crossings, adapts this to the bass in just such a beautiful way. So let's dive in on the bass and take a look at Strokin. So the way Strokin is organized is so cool, and it might be a little bit strange at first because the first part is actually quite short relative to the second and third parts, but you'll understand once you get into it. There is some technical jargon you need to understand to really learn how to use Strokin. No big deal, but I do think it's important, and I always, with the students I work with this on, I go through these symbols so everybody understands what they mean. So the first thing is the W. That just means whole bow. And by that, I'm really trying to be scientific with this book. So I mean from the ferrule right here all the way to the tip on the bow. So we're really paying attention to be using the whole bow. And I'm always trying to execute as perfectly as possible everything that I'm doing in these exercises. So then you have H for half the bow, and that might be a little bit open to interpretation. What does that mean exactly? Well, I generally think of that as being from 1/4 of the way out to 3/4 of the way out. So if you divide the bow into 4, we're going from this point to this point. You could conceivably think of it, this is half the bow or this is half the bow, but Sevcik and Hal also have UH and LH for lower half or upper half. So these are all things you just kind of have to use contextually depending on what you're doing. Generally, and especially in this first part, when I see just half the bow, I'm going from 1/4 of the way from the frog to 1/4 of the way from the tip. And I'm really trying to be scientific about this. I will often take little post-it note flags and put them at the 1/4, half, and 3/4 point on the bow, just so I can be really precise about how much bow I'm using. Now, lower half of the bow and upper half of the bow, oftentimes I think of that as going from frog to middle. And especially for these introductory exercises, I definitely think of that. Or for upper half of the bow, from middle to tip. But as you get more into the exercises, you might find that you want to keep the exercise contained within the lower half of the bow or contained within the upper half of the bow. And maybe you aren't using the exact half of the bow, lower half or upper half. It all depends on the exercise. Then you have F and T. So F means, wait for it, frog. Then T, of course, tip. And so that means just do the exercise at the frog or at the tip. And I really try to challenge myself by seeing how close I can stay to the frog or the tip. I'm always trying to push my boundaries. I think of these as kind of like going to the gym, but for the bow. So I'm not just trying to do the safe and easy thing. I'm trying to just get a little bit farther. How much can I expand what I do on the bass, and what can I do with the bow to just improve my palette? Then M just means in the middle. No big deal. Makes a lot of sense. And again, if I have those post-it note flags, I can really try to stay in the middle of the bow, and I find that super helpful just for staying oriented and really being precise, really trying to make sure that I go just on either side of that middle point and really be scientific with it. Then you have some of these infamous markings that we all are wondering about in our music, lines and dots, lines being legato, détaché. Again, you have to kind of look at the context. The dots being staccato or martelé, short on the string note, again, depending on the context of the exercise. Then when you see the wedge in Strokin, in Sevchik, that just means off the string. So however you're going to interpret that depending on the exercise, that's going to be off the string. Then we have everybody's favorite marking, a line plus a dot, which for centuries people have sort of scratched their heads at. And Hal has a nice definition for that. It's just broad with a space between the notes. And again, depending on speed and context and all of that, we're gonna have these vary a little bit, but these are just kind of guiding principles. And now, a couple of things that can be confusing for people. There is the M with an asterisk. That is in the original Sevchik too, or at least the versions I've looked at. It's in Strokin. And what that means is you're going to take any exercise and do it 3 times. First time, I do it in the middle. Second time, I do it at the frog. And I'm trying to, for the middle, be exactly in the middle, at the frog, exactly at the frog. Then we have it one more time, this time at the tip. And again, as close to the tip as possible, and really try to stay there and get as good a sound, as consistent and similar sound to the other two as I can. And we have one more marking that is very, very useful that Hal puts in, and he puts it in very meticulously, so you have to be careful where it is. That is when you're going to lift the bow from the string. So let's say you had a passage that went. So where precisely are we going to lift the bow? Are we going to play, and by the way, I'm playing D, E, F sharp, and now I have a G that's separate, and then the rest of the notes are separate. So I have a couple options. I can stay on the string for that up bow G, come off the string, and then finish off the string. Or I can play D, E, F sharp connected, and then have the G come from off the string. And you do both of those in orchestral music, solo music. It's a really important thing to think about, and Hal distributes that throughout in just a really, really useful way. So the first part is made up of relatively simple exercises, and I love going back and revisiting this from time to time, in fact fairly regularly, just to think really cleanly and clearly about what I'm doing with the bow. And he lays everything out over a 2-octave scale. He writes a 2-octave C major scale just up and down in this, and I take a scale of the week. Every week I pick a new scale, I go through the cycle of 4ths or 5ths, and I just do Strokin with that scale with the simplest possible fingering. So I do that fingering, no big deal, and back down, and then I take each one of these exercises, which I call cells. I'm not sure what everybody else calls them, but I think of them as cells, and I just take that cell, and they're all numbered, and I apply it to that scale. So again, they start off very simple. Exercise number 1, even bow speed, quarter equals 92, and we're just using the whole bow, so it's going to be like this. Go up into thumb position, come back down. That's what I do at least. So I'm not trying to do anything fancy. I save that for board walking, which is the other book that I love and I did a review about. And I think of that as left-hand school. This is right-hand school, so I'm just trying to give my left hand something to do, so I'm not just playing open strings. Part 1 is really only a few pages, and then we get into part 2, which is, I think of as everything you can do over diatonic scales going up and down. So not using string crossings, besides the string crossings just baked into the scale, but what can we do? And we can do a lot. There are a ton of exercises, and you're going to see that M with an asterisk applied throughout. You're going to see those bow lifts. You're going to see all sorts of good stuff like that. And there are many ways to approach this material. What I keep in mind is what Hal has in the preface, which is 15 to 30 minutes of focused work is going to get you results. Mindless repetition of this stuff or playing this without the attention to detail, I find accomplishes nothing, might even cause harm if you're not careful. Maybe not, but I like to think that. So I just take a few cells. I take maybe 3 to 5 cells a day. And I also like to take a few from part 2, which is running up and down the scales, and part 3, which we're going to get into in just a second. Part 3 is all about string crossings. It's broken down into 2 subsections. Crossing 2 strings, so that could be D and G, A and D, and E and A. So you can run these exercises in a variety of ways, but Hal actually created an etude for this subsection and for the next subsection, which covers multiple strings. And it's just such a cool etude because it gives you all the string combinations and it puts you in different registers of the bass. Let me show you how that goes. A great way to efficiently tackle all the different string combinations and have some harmonic interest. I'm just so thankful that he included this, and he included this as well as the etude for crossing multiple strings on a flap that you can pull out from the back cover, so you can be looking at your music and you can also be looking at that. So he runs you through a whole bunch of different string crossing exercises. I just make sure I'm thinking about weight transfer. I'm thinking about being as meticulous as possible as I'm going through those. Ideally, I'm doing a couple of string crossing cells every day, and I'm doing a couple of up and down diatonic scale exercises every day. And I basically, unless I have a good reason not to, I just kind of go through this like a book. I start at the beginning and I go through, and every once in a while I'll jump around, but I love to go sequentially through parts 1 and 2. Part 1, again, is kind of like an intro for me, so I don't always go back to part 1 every time I restart Strokin, but I go through part 2, I go through part 3, I'm working through all of these each and every day, and it's the most efficient way I've found to dig into the right hand. That's a quick look, not so quick actually, inside Strokin, one of my favorite materials. I use it each and every day. It's one of my desert island books. I recommend it to every student I've worked with over the years. So check out a link to where you can order in the description below. Hit that like button if you enjoyed this video. Hit that like button if you dug this video. Hit that subscribe button if you want to follow along with more of what we're doing, and we'll see you in the next video.